Right. Happy to thank God once again because he has been not good, but great. But in this chapter, where once again we are praying to be able to speak his word accurately. Let's call it he bullies bullies because three of the five nations that Jeremiah is going to prophesy against seem to be notorious for letting their power go to their head. Fourth was more reasonable by reputation, at least in my reading of the word, but still during their reign over much of the free world, they might have gotten carried away a bit. And then the fourth didn't seem to get so much carried away in their power as much as they got carried away in their security and their wealth. Starting off in verse 1, though, he's going to go against or prophesy against the Ammonites in the first 5 verses. Starting off roughly with a question. Has Israel no heirs? Why then has Milcom, as I researched, one of the gods of the Ammonites, dispossessed Gad from the territory of the Israelites? Going back to something we have already seen in the partnership between Ishmael, a member of the royal family left among the remnant, and the Ammonites, who seemed to contract with him to assassinate the governor left over the land. And in his zeal, he killed a lot more people, many of which lost their lives unless they could negotiate with him to offer some kind of blood money as the price of their lives would be taken away as captives. Either way, the Ammonites were the ones who, it was said, he contracted with to create this atrocity among the remnant left over in Judah. So God is sending Jeremiah to prophesy against them, seemingly, if not completely, at least partially, for this crime against the remnant. Going on in verse 2, it'll say, they shall become, or Ammon shall become a mound. Then Israel will dispossess those who dispossessed them. Going on in verses 4 through 6 to say, or rather question, why boast as though no one can oppose you? Because you will indeed be driven away, even though God will have mercy, at least for a while, and restore you. I made a mistake. The prophecy against Ammon goes from 1 through 6, not 1 through 5. Picking up in verses 7 through 22 with a word or a prophecy against Edom. Verse 7 saying, regarding Edom, is there no wisdom left in Edom? Verse 8 going on to call for them to flee from the calamity ahead. Verse 9 saying that they will be stripped bare. Verses 10 and 11 going on to talk about the way that their hiding places will be exposed and their concealment will be removed. Some of their children will be killed, others will be left fatherless, calling them to let your widows trust in me, because apparently they will be many. Verses 12 through 13, going on to say, if less guilty nations, I think in particular Judah, have been judged, how do you think you will escape judgment? Saying that you will descend into a waste. Verses 14 through 16, going on to say that they will be small and despised among the nations, in contrast to the might, apparently, that they enjoyed before, understanding that they were deceived in their ability to terrorize others. Now, however, even though they were in the heights above what seemed to be any possible trouble that could come to them, trouble is going to find them. Verses 17 through 22, describing the way that they will become a horror as Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, never to rise again. Likewise, this will be the metaphor for the end of Edom. Verses 23 through 27, going on to talk about Damascus, the proverbial or the historical capital of Syria. Verse 23, once again, turning attention to Damascus, saying they will be confounded by the bad news of what is ahead for them. Verses 24 through 25, talking about the way that they will grow feeble, anguish and sorrow overtaking them. Verse 26, talking about the way that their soldiers will perish. And in verse 27, concluding that section, saying that it will, or God's judgment will light a fire to devour the strongholds of Ben-Hadad, one of their rulers, famous for his campaigns against either Israel or I think Jerusalem, or maybe even both. Understanding that for a period of time, Syria, like Egypt and Babylon, had been an instrument for God's judgment against Judah. Once again, we're seeing it come full circle to the degree that they went too far. Verses 28 through 33, going on to talk about the judgment against Kedar and Hazor. Verse 28, calling them out by name for destruction, identifying them as the people of the east that verse 29, or who verse 29 is going to say, whose tents, flocks, and camels are about to be taken away as terror will rise on every side. Verse 30, calling them to flee for Nebuchadnezzar has worked a plan against them. Verse 31, saying that they are a nation that dwells securely without gates or bars. Saying once again in verse 32, their camels will be plundered, their goods will be spoiled, as calamity will rise for them on every side. Verse 33, concluding that section by describing the way that Hazor will become a haunt and an everlasting waste. As the end of the chapter from verses 34 through 39 will turn Jeremiah's attention, or God's attention through Jeremiah, to Elam, who I had to look up again, even though I looked them up not long ago, to remember that Elam was a province of the Persians, an otherwise reasonable kingdom, the kingdom that God used to replace Babylon as he was shifting his people, Judah, from their years of exile and servitude back into the kind of people who would be prepared to run their own nation. The Persians were the ones that God worked through to basically guide them back towards independence. Noticing, as we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah, they had at least an inclination that seemed to be more stably focused on justice and equity, which seemed to be a great fit with Judah's rebuilding years. However, even the Persians seemed to go too far at times in their exercise of authority. As verses 34 through 39 will begin in verse 34, once again calling out Elam by name, saying that in the beginning of Zedekiah's reign, the breaking of the bow in verse 35 would mark what God is doing to Elam, essentially breaking the symbol of their might. Verse 36 going on to say that they would be scattered to the four winds. And in verse 37, terrified, going on to say that they would be consumed by the sword. However, in seeming to set up a different end for Elam or Persia than he set up for some of these other kingdoms that he has likened to Sodom and Gomorrah, he says that he is going to set up his throne there and in the latter days restore their fortunes. Elam, or the Medo-Persians, seeming at least at this point to be a nation that God was still willing to work with and through after his days of accountability for them. However, the other three nations we identified more akin to bullies were those who he was breaking down in the Ammonites, talking about the way in verses 1 and 2, they had become keen on dispossessing his people Judah, even though God had only accounted for them 70 years of captivity. Ammon had other plans, at which point God was going to bully them as having prided themselves in being bullies over Judah. Second, in verses 7 through 22, he was bullying the bullies of Edom when he said in verses 14 through 16, more specifically, they have become deceived in their ability to terrorize others, thinking that it could not happen to them. God was turning the tables on them, bullying the bullies. And likewise, in his prophecy against Damascus, as we mentioned in verses 23 through 27, verse 27 mentions the fire that would devour the strongholds of Ben-Hadad. The structures, in case I didn't make that clear, were what survived. Ben-Hadad seemed to have been a king, or the name of two kings that existed years before Jeremiah. And so it seems from the prophet Amos that their line was still a thing, and thus their strongholds, that even though they might have been a power in decline, they were still a power. Naming Ben-Hadad goes back to those days when they were the bully over Israel. I pulled 2 Chronicles 16, noting that they were enough of a bully over Israel and Judah that Asa, king of Judah, paid them off with the goods from the holy places of the Lord so that they would turn their attention away from Judah and go beat up Israel. And so God quite possibly might have used this as an opportunity to say, since you were able to loot some of my goods as protection money, right back at you, bullying the bully. In the final section that we haven't talked about, that section 28 through 33, seems that this was a nation in Kedar and Hazor that were not so much noted for their tendencies to bully, but simply to become too comfortable in their wealth. God shaking them as well, not so much bullying them, but still reminding them that much like power without integrity, wealth without integrity typically only provides the illusion of stability.